So yesterday we learned how to multiply and divide two powers with the same base. That was learning target 1. Today we're going to do learning target 2, which says I can simplify powers with 0 exponents and negative exponents using only positive exponents. So there's two things you need to remember. The first thing that you need to remember is anything with a power of 0 equals 1. Anything. So if you have x to the 0 power, that equals 1. If you have a whole bunch of things to the 0 power, like that, if it's all to the 0 power, it equals 1. Even if it's a fraction, if you have x to the 3rd over y to the 6th, z to the 4th, maybe we'll put an a up there just for good measure, anything, if it's all to the 0 power, it equals 1. Now keeping that in mind, it is only the things with the 0 power. So for example, if you have x squared, and then you have some stuff to the 0 power, so let's say you have 2xy over here, to the 0 power, only this equals 1, because this stuff in parentheses, this is what's being taken to the 0 power. The x squared is not. So this would actually equal x squared times 1, because this over here is what equals the 1, which would just equal x squared. Anything taken to the 0 power, whether it's one factor, a whole bunch of factors, a quotient of factors, or anything that's taken to the 0 power within a bigger expression, just the stuff taken to the 0 power always equals 1. The second thing that we're going to learn is how to deal with negative exponents. Whenever you have a negative exponent, the negative exponent just means that you move that factor to the other part of the fraction, either from the numerator to the denominator or from the denominator to the numerator. And once you move it, then you make the exponent of that factor positive. So for example, if you have x to the negative 6, that's a negative exponent. And really, it is currently in the numerator of a fraction, because if it doesn't look like a fraction, we can divide it by 1 and make it a fraction. So what this tells us to do, that negative up there, all that means is that we move it to the other part of the fraction, and when we do that, we're actually going to make it a positive 6 up there, because the negative just means move it, and once we move it, we can then make it positive because we did what it told us to do. So this actually turns into, if we draw our fraction line, it's going to come onto the bottom and then be a positive 6. And because there's nothing left on top, we're just going to put a 1 up there as a placeholder. Now let's say you have something that's already on the bottom. Let's say you have x to the negative 2, and maybe you have a, I don't know, y to the 3rd power up here. So let's say you're confronted with something like this. So I'm going to draw my fraction line, and I'm going to look at each factor. The y to the 3rd power is a factor. The x to the negative 2 power is a factor. And I'm going to look at each factor, and I'm going to decide stay or move. If it has a positive exponent, it's going to stay where it is. If it has a negative exponent, I'm going to move it to the other part of the fraction and then make it positive. So if I look at this first factor, y to the 3rd, because this is a positive 3, it's going to stay right where it is on top of the fraction. Then I'm going to look at x to the negative 2. That's a negative exponent. A negative exponent means it moves. This moves to the top of the fraction up here. And then because I moved it, now it can be positive. And now there's nothing underneath here, so I can just put a placeholder as a 1, which is really just that. Because anything over 1 is just itself. So let's look at if we have, let's say we have an expression that looks like this. We have 4, I don't know, a to the third, b to the negative 7. Let's say we have this. So I'm going to draw my fraction line, and I'm going to ask myself about each individual factor. The 4 is a factor, a to the third is a factor, b to the negative 7 is a factor. A factor is something that's multiplying something else. So there are 3 things multiplying each other here. There's a 4, an a to the third, and a b to the negative 7. So there's 3 factors. I'm going to look at each factor, and I'm going to decide if it stays or moves. Currently, it's all on the top. So the 4 does not have a negative exponent. It just has a 1 right there, really. And so that stays on the top, right where it is. A to the third is on the top right now, and because it has a positive exponent, it's going to stay on the top. B to the negative 7 has a negative exponent, and because it has a negative exponent, it's going to move to the bottom and become b to the positive 7. Now sometimes, after simplifying, you are going to end up getting a negative number for an answer. For example, let's look at, let's see, x to the 5th over x to the 7th. Now we learned in Learning Target 1 that to divide fractions, we subtract the exponents, or sorry, to divide powers with the same base, we subtract the exponents. Top minus bottom, so like 5 minus 2. So here it would be x to the 5 minus 7, which equals x to the negative 2. But we cannot just leave this negative exponent here. We need to fix that. So this actually turns into, it's on the top right now. If I draw my fraction line, it's going to move to the bottom and be x to the positive 2 down there. Because when I move it, the exponent changes to the positive. And then there's nothing up there, so I'm just going to put a 1 as a placeholder. So if we look back up here, we have a couple situations where we actually need to fix what we did. This one right here, we have an x to the negative 3 power. So really, that's on the top right now of the fraction, if we think of it like that. That's actually going to move to the bottom and become x to the positive 3, like that. And over here, same thing, we have an a to the negative 7, b to the 9. If you think of all of that being on the top of a fraction right now, if I draw my fraction line, a to the negative 7 is going to move to the bottom because of this negative exponent right there. And b to the 9th, that will stay on the top because it's a positive, so it stays right where it is. And so the 2 new things that we learned is anything with a 0 power, anything to the 0 power equals 1. And anytime you have a negative exponent, that means you need to move it to the other part of the fraction and make it the positive version of that exponent. And that is all for Learning Target 2.